Hello everyone, hope you all are doing well. Today we will discuss the summary of chapter number 4 and chapter number 5 of Why Nations Fail. So let's move on to chapter number 4. Number 4 is titled as Small Differences and Critical Junctures. In this chapter, the author has discussed the following 5 sections: the world the plague has created, the making of inclusive institutions, small differences that matter, the contingent part of history, understanding the lay of land. So we will move on to our first section, the world the plague created. In this section, the author has discussed how the Black Death spread across Europe in the 14th century and it killed roughly half of its population. This was basically a disaster, but it is very important in understanding the present day Europe. Before this disaster, the Black Death, the Europe was organized into an extractive and feudal system in which the king granted their land to lords. But after this event, so many people died and there was a labor shortage in England. So in England, the peasants who survived, they started gaining more bargaining power because they were less in number. So they just started demanding higher wages. The English government tried to freeze the wages and imprison those workers who were rebelling them, but it was impossible because in response the peasants rebelled in 1381 and the government withdrew these policies. So in return, the labor market became more inclusive. This was the case in the Western Europe. However, in the Eastern Europe, the land ownership was more concentrated and there were the lords had more power. So that is why when the peasants rebelled there, they weren't as successful as they were in the Eastern Europe. So the landlords actually consolidated their power after the Black Death and imposed even more restrictive, extractive conditions on the worker. For instance, it drove the peasant wages substantially down in the 16th century. So we can see that the same thing happened in the Eastern Europe and in the Western Europe, but there has been a different result in both parts. The author has synthesized an argument that how critical junctures can drive rapid change toward either inclusiveness or extractiveness. So this is how the first section ends, and in the second section, which is the making of inclusive institutions, the authors explain how England started to grow rapidly in the 17th century because of its inclusive institutions, because of these inclusive institutions were a result of the English Civil War and in particular the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Glorious Revolution gave Parliament the power to set economic policies and it allowed a broad cross-section of society to participate in politics for the first time. So these reforms created strong property rights and a uniform tax code. These intensive drove technological advances like the steam engine, which then spurred the Industrial Revolution, but they wouldn't have been possible without England's inclusive institutions. And this is how we can say that the making of inclusive institutions has benefited the Europe and specifically England. In the next section, which is the small differences that mattered, the authors argued that political institutions determined which countries adopted the Industrial Revolution technologies and which will not. In the 16th century, England, France, and Spain all had the absolutist governments, like all have monarchy. But England's monarchy was a bit unique because it was reliant on the taxation. That is why it gave Parliament significant power over it. That is why the Queen Elizabeth I wasn't as powerful as the monarchs of French and Spain. So the monarchy in England needed to work with intermediary traders. These traders started demanding and winning political changes that comparable merchants in France and Spain couldn't even think of asking. That is why the countries with small institutional difference can move in opposite direction. That is why we can see a remarkable difference in the Spain, France, and England of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. There were just small institutional differences, but Eastern Europe and Western Europe has large institutional differences. For example, in the Eastern Europe, the feudal system was much stronger. That is why their development was a extremely slow as compared to the Western Europe. In the next section, which is the contingent part of history, the authors argued that while existing institutions shape the way a society responds to these critical junctures, but these responses are never set in stone. Like they are always historically contingent. For example, they are possible and might be possible, and it depend on which coalition managed to take and exercise power in any given historical moment. For example, as we have seen in the first section, that after the Black Death, the Eastern Europe moved in a different direction and the Western Europe moved in a different direction. So this is the pattern which the author is discussing here. They have mentioned an example. For example, the Glorious Revolution was in part contingent on Britain's powerful merchant class, whose wealth was contingent on the unexpected English defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. So the author wanted to say that all this happened in sections. For example, if there hasn't been Glorious Revolution, there hasn't been inclusive institutions. But the author also discussed that Glorious Revolution was also because the English have been defeated by the Spanish army in the Spanish Armada in 1588. So this is how things work. Like the downfall of English monarchy leads toward the revolution, and then the revolution leads towards the inclusive institution. In the next section, understanding the lay of the land, the authors applied their theory about institutional differences on different parts of the world, and they explained how different parts of the world developed differently after the Industrial Revolution. They have quoted the case of England settler colonies, for example the US, Canada and Australia, and they said they tended to develop in the pluralistic political institutions similar to the England's institutions. And in France, after the Industrial Revolution, it caused political revolution which ushered in more inclusive political and economic institutions. However, in Latin America, there has been extractive colonial institutions, and in sub-Saharan Africa, in the institutions have been extremely extractive because there hasn't been a centralized state. Moreover, there has been a slave trade which encouraged the African state, for example like the Kingdom of Congo, to build extremely absolutist institutions. Then in other part of the countries, like in Asian countries, they also struggle to build inclusive institutions till in the 19th century, because the Chinese monarchs have also an absolutist system, and they had halted the commerce extremely. In the mid 1800s, after the Opium Wars, it made China more absolutist, but due to institutional differences, the US interventions in Japan, it actually helped the monarchy's opponent overthrow it. So after the Meiji Restoration, which is an extremely powerful revolution, Japan built more inclusive institutions and started growing rapidly, just like the South Korea, Taiwan and China have done in the 20th century. So, and if we discuss the case of Argentina and Russia, there has also been extractive institutions and it has sent nations into economic decline. Then there has been a case of Ottoman Empire, who was also very absolutist and highly extractive institutions. It wasn't as highly centralized as other empires, and after World War I, European empires took over most of the Middle East and imposed extractive policies similar to those in Latin America and Africa. That is why the Middle Eastern countries fell into extreme poverty. So basically, the authors tried to say that the institutional differences are the only good explanation for global inequality, and they have discussed the case of all the main countries and nations of the world. From this point, the rest of the book will expand on this theory, and it will apply into a variety of situations, and the author will explain how some countries have managed to build more inclusive institutions. So let's move on to our chapter number 5. Chapter number 5 is titled as I Have Seen the Future, and it works growth under extractive institutions. It has been divided into the 5 sections: I have seen the future, on the banks of Kasai, the long summer, the unstable extraction, and what goes wrong. First section, I have seen the future. In this section, the authors tried to synthesize an argument that most societies have had extractive economic and political institutions, but they still manage to achieve some economic growth. But the main crux here is that the growth is based on existing technology, while growth in inclusive societies is based on technological change. And they have tried to explain this argument with certain examples. For example, after the World War One, the US sent the journalist whose name was Lincoln Stephens to interview Lenin and to know about the Soviet Union's economic plans. When the journalist returned back, he announced, "I have seen the future and it works." So this, and it actually did. But in 1928, Lenin's successor Stalin collectivized all farmland and hiked up taxes to fund the Soviet economic industrialization, which caused a severe famine and killed millions. But the Soviet Union was still growing quickly. So how a state under extractive institutions were growing. The authors try to explain this. They say that state controlled economics never allocate resources as efficiently as the free market, but they can still grow if the state invests in the most productive industries. For example, the Caribbean slave societies grew by investing in sugar, and the Soviet Union grew by investing in industry. That is why the Soviet Union and Western Europe was at the same level during the 19th century. More specifically in from 1920 to 1960, but after 1960 its growth abruptly stopped. So this proved how the extractive economic institution can't generate long-term growth because they don't incentivize innovation and they give elites the power to stop creative destruction. That is why the Soviet economy just stopped growing after it finished reallocating untapped resources from agriculture to industry. And after in the next section, which is on the banks of Kasai, the author describes the differences between the people, the Lele people and the Bushong people who lives on the opposite banks of the Kasai River in the Congo. Although the two groups are extremely similar, the Bushong peoples are far richer and more economically productive. The reason for this inequality was that in the 17th century, there was a king whose name was Siam. He created the absolute extractive Cuba kingdom, and he imposed a new farming technique. And because of his techniques, there had been a double food production, and he forced men to spend few years fighting and more working in the field. The Siam centralized and organized society enough to create an economic surplus. He has been succeeded in generating the economic surplus, but he just kept it for himself. This shows how extractive institutions can create some prosperity and how this can have long-term effects. The next section is the long summer. In this section, the authors generated another argument that in the 9600 BC, there have been a Neolithic revolution, and it changed the human from nomadic hunting gathering to a sedentary farming and herding society. And this is because of in result of a long summer, there has been a period of drastic heat on the earth. Neolithic revolution brought a drastic change in the human history, and there has been so much development, but the authors claimed that this society didn't create long-term prosperity because its institutions were extractive instead of inclusive. That is why they likely prompted in fighting among elites, and whatever it has created was just a matter of a time, and it only helped and it was favorable only for the elites of that place, not for everyone. So this is how extractive institutions work. In the next section, which is the unstable extraction, the author has put forward a case of the Maya city-state. The greatest Maya city-states collapsed around the year 9th century. They weren't part of the same empire, but they shared many institutions like a common writing system and calendar. And this system led to rapid economic expansion, labor specialization, and trade between the city-states. But after the Maya city-states formed, their technology barely advanced. Instead of innovation, the Maya focused on war, and this shows that Maya city-states institutions were extremely extractive. and that is why the growth there was unsustainable, and the elites fight to control the resources they extract from the masses. So in the last section, which is what goes wrong, the author tried to summarize all their arguments in the last section, and they say when elites set up extractive political and economic institutions, they invest and spur economic growth so that they can extract a surplus for themselves. This process often creates powerful centralized institutions, like we have discussed Siam's kingdom of Congo, and then there is Neolithic revolution, but extractive institutions don't incentivize innovation. That is why the growth under extractive institutions cannot be long term. The growth under extractive policies can be extremely fast, but as we can see in the present day China, but the author claims that they are unlikely to be sustainable in the long term. So this is how the chapter 5 ends, and we will be back with our next video in which we will present you the summary of chapter number 6 and chapter number 7. Till then, stay tuned. Allah Hafiz.